The first page of the Aggregation Wizard allows you to review and change aggregation usage for attributes in each dimension. Usually the default value is sufficient, but you can modify these settings when running the wizard each time, or you can configure the property on each attribute to force a setting to the desired value so that you don't have to change it each time you run the Aggregation Wizard. There are 4 possible values for aggregation usage. The value set initially for all attributes is default. We'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. First, we need to understand the other possible values. Full is the setting to use when you always want an attribute to appear in an aggregation. Now, if the attribute is in a user hierarchy, analysis services might decide to use a lower level attribute instead. For example, if you specify year, it could use quarter instead because it can still easily derive year. You should only set an attribute's aggregation usage to full when you know that most queries always use the attribute, but you should only use it if the number of members for that attribute is relatively small. Again, using year as an example, if we have only 5 years of data in a cube and users constantly query by year, it would make sense to use full. The opposite option is to use none. This setting prevents an attribute from appearing in any aggregation. You should use this setting for attributes that need to be in the dimension but are not commonly used in queries, or for queries that users don't mind accepting potentially slower performance. The last option is unrestricted. Essentially, this puts no constraints on the attribute. It may or may not be used to create an aggregation. It makes sense to use this setting if an attribute is commonly used or you know that a particular hierarchy is having query performance issues. If the attribute is in a user hierarchy, analysis services might add an aggregation that winds up helping the drill-down experience within the hierarchy. In this case, analysis services decides whether or not to use an attribute, whereas with full or none, we are making the decision. Although we might be tempted to set everything to unrestricted, the rule of thumb is to use between 5 to 10 unrestricted attributes per dimension. Any more, and we risk significantly increasing the amount of time that analysis services needs to come up with aggregation designs. If we leave the aggregation usage setting to default, then analysis services applies certain rules to determine the effective setting. If an attribute is the granularity attribute for a dimension in a regular relationship with a measure group, it's considered to be configured with the unrestricted setting. The granularity attribute is usually the key attribute, the attribute with a column in the fact table, but not always. The special dimension types are set to none, so analysis services will purposely exclude these attributes from aggregations. Special dimension types include an attribute in a many-to-many dimension relationship, an unmaterialized reference dimension, or a data mining dimension. If we set up a natural hierarchy as a user hierarchy and ensure we have attribute relationships in place correctly, then these attributes are considered as unrestricted. A natural hierarchy is one in which we have a one-to-many relationship between each level from the top down. For example, 1 year has 4 quarters, and 1 quarter has 3 months, and so on. A non-aggregatable attribute is one for which the isAggregatable property is set to false. In that case, the full setting is applied. Every member needs to be represented in every aggregation. For everything else, analysis services excludes the attribute from all aggregations.